Hello and welcome to Idaho Bigfoot. I'm your host Jephthah, or Jep for short. Today I am joined by my very grumpy and very tired assistant, Ushi. I'm just kidding, she's not grumpy right now, right Ush Bear? Yeah, she's happy. Yeah, she's happy, just a little tired. She's a good girl. She's a nice assistant. I'm glad to have her back on camera. The last time I had her on camera was months ago. It was when I was trying to film a part for a series that I'm doing, How Aggressive Are Sasquatch. I put up part 1 a little while back. Doesn't have a lot of views. The audio quality was giving me a hard time in that video, so I'm a little frustrated by that video, but overall I think it turned out pretty well. I brought out a lot of good information, which I will be referencing in this video. But I was preparing to discuss my encounters in a later on down the road episode, and I was able to have her on camera. Then only, I think, 2-3 weeks later, maybe a little bit longer than that, it's hard to tell, time just kind of mushes together, she had to have surgery. And we were told that if we had waited much longer, she could have died. We got worried for her because she loves eating food. Like, eating is probably her favorite thing to do, like most dogs. She didn't want to eat anything. And we got really worried for her and had to take her into the vet, and thankfully we were able to get good help. But, we came pretty close to losing her, and that was scary. So I'm glad that she's okay. She's doing well. She has her brace on because she does have some issues with arthritis and being stiff, and this helps her feel more comfortable and it helps her walk better. And in fact, I'm having some issues of my own, which is part of the reason why we're inside. I wanted to have her on camera, for one. It's kind of uncomfortable out where I tend to film. I don't have a good setup for her to lie on. It's on a table with the dog bed on, and it's difficult for her to get into the building, let alone onto the bed, and I have to try and pick her up a lot. And I can't really do that right now, especially because I'm having some knee issues. I had a knee injury, and I'm having to stay inside and try and keep it elevated. I have it somewhat elevated, but it's not enough. It needs to be above my heart, but I can't really do that right now. Trying to keep an eye on it, trying to make sure that I don't have any further issues, and we're going to have to see what goes on there. But nonetheless, we have to be inside for this, so that's why we're in such a different environment for this video. But I'm happy to have her on camera, and I'm glad I'm feeling better so I can do this. It hurt a few days ago. Thankfully, the pain has definitely gone down. Now it's just kind of uncomfortable trying to walk around everywhere like this. But we're both wearing our braces, and we're both trying to keep going. But before we get in to this, I would like to ask for your support. If you could please just leave a simple comment down below after you've watched the video, or even if you're just going to say, okay, starting to watch the video, thank you for doing this, or, whatever, I don't know. It's up to you. I can't put words in your mouth. It's up to you what you want to say, but if you just want to make a simple comment, it would mean a lot. One of the reasons I say this is not just because I do like to hear what people think, and I do like to talk with people who watch the channel, but also because if you leave a comment, YouTube will know that you like the content and will kind of share the video out a little bit more. It gets more attention that way. It's how the algorithms work. So if you leave just even a simple comment, that would mean a lot. It would help me out, and I like hearing from you. And if you could please click the share button down below the video and click copy link, that would help out a lot, even if you don't share it anywhere, because that way YouTube knows that you're copying the link. If you copy from the header bar, if you're on your browser, for example, you just copy the header bar, it won't help. YouTube won't know what you're doing. But if you click the share button and then copy link, that does help me out a lot. And you can take that link anywhere you want. If you want to share it, you can share it to Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, whatever, via text messages, email, you name it. And that would mean a lot to me. But even if you don't do that, you just want to click the copy link to help me out, that would mean a lot. And if you do want to donate to the channel, I have the Buy Me a Coffee link down below. I think I said it at $3. That little goes a long way. But I think you can also set up specific amounts. If you just want to do $1, that helps. So you can do that. But you can also just let an ad or two play on the video. I try to keep them sparse. I don't want you getting overwhelmed with ads. I know a lot of channels do that. It annoys me. So if you just let an ad play, just mute it, go get yourself some coffee or tea, or go use the restroom even for a moment, and come back and just let the video play, you know, whatever. It would mean a lot to me because that does help me out a lot. But whatever you want to do, I'm comfortable with it if you're comfortable with it. I do appreciate the support no matter what you do. It does mean a lot to me. But to get right into today's video, we're talking about Sasquatch burying their dead. And this idea was brought up as a topic for discussion by, let me see here, want to make sure I get his name right, by a Mr. Avery Wilkinson. He's a subscriber who brought up the idea in the comment section of my video entitled 5 Misconceptions Made by Bigfoot Believers. I believe that's a must-watch. Even if you've been in the field for 30, 40 years or more, I brought up some very good points. And like everything, I try to back it up with sources and not just a trust me kind of situation. I found a lot of people in the field of Bigfoot research, and I'm not calling anyone out by name, but a lot of people tend to do the, well, just trust me, I know what I'm doing, just trust me. We can't do that in this day and age. It's just, trust has been blown so many times in people's individual lives, via certain individuals in the public, you name it. It's just, it's hard to trust anymore. So I try to back up everything I put out with facts and information, and you can kind of make up your own decisions on certain matters. But I brought up some very good points, and a lot of them were based off of my own personal experiences as well that I've documented. And one of the things I talked about in that video was the fact that people have made the claim that bones disappear like that out in the woods, and that's not always true. I'm not saying it's never true, because sometimes it could be, and supposedly has been the case, but oftentimes bones stick around. Now, maybe only 1 or 2, but there are bones that stick around. Usually, the reason why bones disappear is they're just carried off by predators. That doesn't mean that they disappear from existence. And even then, you know, the animals that do eat the bones, there's so many factors as to why they'd be there, how many are in the area, whether or not they're able to get to the bones easily, you name it. And environmental factors, the time of year that the animal died, plays a huge factor in all of this. There's just so much to look at. It's not a completely honest point. It's a half-truth. And I went into that, and I brought up some evidence for, you know, rodents eating bones, but it's not entirely true that they'll just gobble up bones. It's difficult to say, really. And that kind of spawned this topic of discussion about one of the things that people have claimed is that Bigfoot bury their dead. And this is in response to skeptics and skeptically minded people wondering where the bones are. Because for every other animal on Earth, just about, we have bones to prove that they exist. It's not just seeing them here and now, but seeing the bodies of the ones that died sometimes very long ago. And so if you can't find bones for Bigfoot, a lot of people feel like that just means that they don't exist. It's just all fairy tale. And, you know, it could be, but I don't believe so. I believe I've seen one. I know other people who are very confident that they saw one. And so, you know, if they exist, there should be logical ways to explain away how they can exist without certain pieces of evidence either existing or not slapping people in the face and people recognizing it. And you'll understand what I mean by that probably a little bit later, but if they exist, there should be logical, reasonable answers to these questions. And one of the things that I want to bring out is that I'm just going to kind of read this off of the paper here, because I think I wrote it better than I could probably say it if I were to just kind of ad-lib here. If my hypotheses and opinions do not prove true over time, then I suppose you could say that they are excuses. If they do prove true, however, then they are explanations. An excuse may make complete sense in the moment, but over time it falls apart, whereas an explanation may be puzzling at first and hard to fathom in the moment, but over time it is proven true and is easier and easier to understand. Time will tell. So we're just going to have to kind of play it by ear and see. So, let's dive in now, shall we? There are a number of things that need to be discussed before we get into the answer of do Sasquatch bury their dead, because there's a lot that goes into this. And one of the things that I want to look at are mortality rates. So let's look at that here real quickly. According to Eric Dockett's article on Exemplore, entitled, "If Bigfoot is Real, Where Are the Bones?" quote, In the lower 48 states, there are less than 1,500 grizzly bears, and about 31,000 in Alaska. We can assume there are fewer Bigfoot than grizzly bears. In fact, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization estimates that there may be between 2,000 and 6,000 Bigfoot in all of North America, but emphasizes that the usual methods of estimating animals' population do not apply very well here. Now, one argument made is that because of the low number count, or population number, of Bigfoot, they would likely be a rare species. And so it isn't likely that you would find a dead Sasquatch. Now, Dr. Grover Krantz talked to numerous individuals who had a lot of time in the outdoors, and he said that he found that most of these people did not find dead bears when out in the wilderness. And the argument is that, therefore, why would people find dead Bigfoot if they don't typically find dead bears, even though bears are much more populous in number? Well, in Matthew Pruitt's book, The Phenomenal Sasquatch, it's a pretty good book so far, he made some interesting points to that effect, and said this under Chapter 9, entitled The Primary Contentions. He brought up the argument that I did, that skeptics have made in the past, and that is the lack of bone matter, and wrote this under the subheading, The Likelihood of a Random Discovery. Many assume that a population of large apes would produce remains in sufficient numbers each year that they would be easily discovered. This assumption has led most skeptics to conclude that, in lieu of these discoveries, no such species exists. If Sasquatches do exist, the expectation that their remains would be encountered by people engaged in activities other than searching for them is not a realistic one. Primates, especially apes, are characterized by a long lifespan compared to other mammals. For example, chimpanzees live approximately twice as long as mortality data would predict based on size alone. Apes require many years to reach reproductive age, usually producing only a single offspring at a time. Given the long maturation date of these offspring, the interbirth intervals, or time between reproductions, of apes often take many years. Of the known apes, the orangutan has the slowest life history, slower than that of any known primate. If Sasquatches evolved from the related Asian ape lineage that produced Gigantopithecus blacki, then we might expect him to have a similarly slow life history. In addition to the extended lifespan that apes experience, studies have shown that larger animals live longer than smaller ones. Now he goes into how large animals have slower metabolic rates, and he went into how the largest apes, gorillas, tend to live to be about 40 years old in their natural habitat, and how there is an upward trend in size and average age. So it's reasonable to postulate that Sasquatches, which would be the biggest out there, would live significantly longer, perhaps being about 50 to 60 years old on average. And given the natural mortality rates of adults among known apes, we might expect Sasquatches to have an adult mortality rate of 2 to 4% annually. He said, within a given ecoregion, the southern Appalachian rainforest, or the greater Yellowstone area, for example, only a few Sasquatches would die each year. Within a specific location, the Bluff Creek drainage in California, for example, a Sasquatch might only die once every decade or more. He also said, how would such deaths occur? Adult animals with no natural predators don't simply drop dead. They typically experience a long, slow process of declining energy, compromised function and mobility, and an increased level of pain or discomfort over an extended period of time. During this process, such animals will seek refuge within the most secluded portions of their home ranges to reduce their vulnerability and minimize energy expenditures. It is in these places that the animal will eventually expire. These defensible and secure havens tend to be far from roads, trails, campgrounds, or other areas of human activity. In other words, animals that die slow natural deaths do so in places where humans rarely venture. This makes the chances of a random discovery very low. He talked about how by the time someone is able to find the bones, basically it's quite possible that the bone will be less and less recognizable, and that only certain bones, like the ones that comprise the skull, would be distinct enough to warrant inspection and collection by people. And these would have to be the right people. Most people out in the woods don't have those kind of credentials, and would probably assume that it belonged to a more well-known animal unless they saw an intact or nearly intact skull. Now, I've found plenty of bones out in the woods, and I can attest that I can't just look at a bone and identify where it came from. Most people can't really do that. Now, I do feel it is important to note that he is not counting any of the field biologists or zoologists or any competent individuals who do go out into these forests on a regular basis trying to find any signs of animals or trying to find skeletons or any kind of discoveries like that. There are individuals who have found dead black bears, and I've also found dead mountain lions as well. I don't know if I mentioned mountain lions in the beginning here, but that was one of the animals that people have asked about, and I know there's been claims that many hunters have never found a dead mountain lion. Well, there are some who have. And I actually remember seeing an interaction on Facebook between two people who both frequented the same area. One never found any dead bears, and the other has found numerous dead bears. It seemed to entail black bears. They both seemed to be genuine, too. It didn't seem like one was lying and the other one, was telling the truth. It seemed like both were telling the truth. And so, seeing how two people can be in the same area and have such differing experiences is fascinating. But I think it does show that it really depends on a number of factors whether or not you find anything. It's kind of the luck of the draw. Now, one way of estimating the likelihood of finding a dead Sasquatch is by figuring out how long they live. Now, Eric Dockett's for Exemplore's article did this as well and said, "It may not be fair to compare Bigfoot's lifespan and mortality rate with that of humans, given the medical attention we receive. Instead, let's use gorillas as an analog. According to the WWF, wild gorillas live to be about 40 years of age and experience an adult mortality rate of about 5%. So he's looking at a mortality rate slightly higher than that of Matt Pruitt's book. His was 2 to 4%, if I remember correctly. This guy says 5%. Of course, everything fluctuates, and there's so many different pieces of information that need to be factored in, and things can change over time, so it's a little difficult to put an exact number on everything. But as he said here, continuing on, if we apply that percentage to Sasquatch using the BFRO's population estimates, that would mean there are only between 100 and 300 Bigfoot carcasses on the ground in any given year across all of North America, from the swamps of Florida to the grasslands of Ohio to the forests of Alaska. Of course, this is only a guess. Bigfoot may live much longer and have a much lower mortality rate. If fewer than 100 Bigfoot bodies are available to find every year, and this animal lives in such remote locations, what are the chances someone will find one?" It's a very good question. And we will go into what Matt Pruitt said about someone stumbling upon a Bigfoot body later on. But to continue on the mortality rate portion here, I can't really do a good job estimating mortality rates. If someone watching this wants to undertake the effort, I would be happy to see what they come up with. You're more than welcome to do so. But what I can do is bring up some information about the topic of aging. And yes, I did say aging. One of the things that we must keep in mind is that Sasquatch are not like apes in that Bigfoot are always reported as moving. They are apparently efficient walkers and traverse a lot of land. I would imagine the only times that this is not true is on very hot days. The reason being is that they need to stay cool. I know here in Idaho we've had, and other parts of the U.S. as well, we've seen days as hot as 119 degrees Fahrenheit. So I highly doubt anything covered in hair is going to want to move around on those days. But otherwise they move around a lot, and I know gorillas and other apes do not move around very much at all. And this was noted by Herman Poncer in his article in the Scientific American article entitled "Humans Evolved to Exercise." And he said this: "Great apes spend 8 to 10 hours a day resting, grooming, and eating before knocking off in the evening for 9 to 10 hours of sleep per night. Chimps and bonobos walk about 3 kilometers a day, and gorillas and orangutans travel even less." So they are not active, per se, creatures. However, we as human beings are. If we look at mortality rates for hunter-gatherers in Africa, as the article entitled "Hunter-gatherers Live Nearly as Long as We Do, but with Limited Access to Healthcare," by Vibar, Krieg, and Reed in 2018, it said this: Today in the UK and the US, infant mortality rates are well below 1%. So to speak of an average or mean age of death makes perfect sense. Those numbers really do tell us how long, on average, the people in that community live. For hunter-gatherer communities, we need a different mathematical model because without healthcare, infant mortality rates could be in the region of 20 to 40%. If nearly half a group dies in infancy and the other half live well into their early 50s, that yields a mean life expectancy of 25. Misleading and not in the least helpful for telling us how long people live for. In hunter-gatherer groups, life was and is undeniably hard, but their lifespan was not as short as the numbers press us to think. If you were a hunter-gatherer and you made it to adolescence, there was a strong likelihood that you would live a long and healthy life. Not so different from modern humans. The Chimene, for example, are an indigenous forager people of lowland Bolivia, and their modial lifespan is 70 years, modial being the number that appears with the greatest frequency in a given dataset. People in wealthier countries with advanced healthcare and better diets do live longer. But instead of the 50 years difference we hear bandied about, it is just a few years. Now, a piece entitled "We Are All Bushmen and Women" by Nick Geer, Professor Emeritus at the University of Idaho, said this: "The Kalahari Meerkat Project reports that about 50% of their children die before they are 15, and 20% die in their first year. Life expectancy is estimated between 40 and 50 years. Only 10% survive past the age of 60. As with all indigenous peoples facing integration into contemporary society, a fine balance between preserving language and culture and benefiting from modern medicine and education must be attained." So the death rates don't sound much better. However, we must factor in the fact that Bushmen still live in a group. According to one source, owing to environmental constraints, a group will consist of between 80 and 120 people living and moving together. In times of shortage, the groups will be much smaller, sometimes consisting of only immediate family, parents, grandparents, and children. Now, my point here is that disease can spread much more easily when you're in a group. And the Bushmen are a people that interacts with other groups, and so disease that would normally keep away from them can now contact them. Sasquatch don't seem to interact with people very much, and there's little to no reason to believe that they move in large groups either. They never have, apparently. The only exceptions to this are the very few trackways that show a large adult, a medium-sized adult, and a baby, likely entailing a father, a mother, and a child. However, Sasquatch males may be like male tigers, where they interact with their mates and their offspring by going in a large loop through their territory, only staying with any one mate for a short period of time. The likelihood that they would contract disease and spread it is very low, and once an individual reaches adulthood, primary concerns drop drastically. In the Americas, before we had massive bears, American lions, and smilodons, but we only have small grizzlies in the lower 48 these days, mountain lions and wolves as well, and none of these would probably risk going after an animal that is able to fight back, unless things get really desperate. Bushmen, however, still deal with all sorts of predators, and so once the disease and predatory concerns are removed from the equation, then I believe that the survival rate will likely go up, perhaps significantly. I feel that because of the fine hunting and scavenging opportunities here in the Pacific Northwest, with a great abundance of prey animals and a lack of true competition here in the lower 48 for the role of top predator, once a kill is made, it's more or less yours. And this combined with the fantastic natural camouflage, fine stalking skills, and great throwing ability that they have, and supposed ability to mimic other animals, also being able to access prey and supplement it with other food sources like pawpaws in the south and apples up here, then all in all, food is just fine. Of course, depending on the environment, they may have to deal with more predators, and they may not be the top dog. Alaska comes to mind, as well as places like the Yukon, where you get very big bears. And yes, I am a proponent of the idea that a bear could kill a Bigfoot. At least one of the larger bears. But all in all, when you factor everything in, Bigfoot tend to have it go pretty easily for them when it comes to gathering food and having areas to live where they don't have to deal with predators. Most of the areas where they're sighted are actually pretty good areas to live if you are a Bigfoot-sized creature. Now, Sasquatch are also usually located where there's plenty of water and where there's a lot of tree cover, so survival here may not be as difficult here as it is where the Bushmen are located. That is, until winter hits. But it's difficult to say. It's an apples and oranges comparison, and we're looking at two different types of beings. And we will be going into down the road how Sasquatch survive winter, because that is a very big question. And I almost did that video instead, but I did a poll on both Instagram and YouTube and found that a lot of people wanted to see this video more. So I'm doing this one first. But I will be doing how Sasquatch survive cold winters in a little while. Now, something I want to cite is that Sasquatch live one of the healthier lifestyles anyone could live. And I say this because they're almost always reported as moving about a lot. According to the Harvard-gazette's article, No One Outruns Death, but Hunter-gatherers Come Closest, written by Alvin Powell in 2021, quote, research on the rewards of exercise, including findings on how it protects mental health and helps us burn calories and maintain strength, is prodigious. These benefits, Lieberman said, grow more important as we age. He cited a long-running study of 21,000 Harvard graduates that showed that regular, moderate to vigorous exercise, burning 2,000 or more calories per week, lowered death rates 21% among those aged 25 to 49, 36% among those 50 to 59, and 50% among those 70 to 84. So if this information is factored into the mortality rates, then said mortality rates may be lower than 5%. Now, old age may be possible for them, but it's hard to say. It's also possible that if their adult death rates are low, and their conception rates and or birth rates are low because of a very human physique, then the likelihood you'd find an adult Sasquatch dead is, well, low. One point I've brought out before is that they may struggle to give birth safely. And this is a point that I made in the video How Aggressive Are Sasquatch, Part 1. Women today still have difficulty, even with medical advancements, with having safe pregnancies and keeping mother and child safe during the birthing process. To quote the National Library of Medicine, for every minute of every day of every year, year in and year out, somewhere in the world a woman dies of complications arising from pregnancy or childbirth. More than 600,000 women die needlessly every year. The majority of these mothers die without skilled care, perhaps lying on a dirt-ridden floor attended only by the women of their families, or untrained birth attendants using traditional, harmful practices. They die in pain, in fear, and in vain. Babies suffer too. Maternal mortality and morbidity have a direct impact on the health and well-being of the newborn. Around 98% of the nearly 6 million stillbirths or deaths of babies in the first week of life occur in developing countries. Most will die because of maternal complications, a third being due to the intrapartum complications leading to birth asphyxia. Babies who survive their mother's death seldom reach their first birthday, and millions of older, motherless children face uncertain futures. Now, of course, that's very sad, but it does show how human birthing is much more difficult and arguably painful, it seems, than that of large apes. Now, according to another article by SciTech Daily this time, quote, this was long believed to be due to humans' bigger brains and the limited dimensions of the mother's pelvis. Researchers at the University of Zurich have now shown, using 3D simulations, that birthing was likewise a highly complicated procedure in early hominin species that gave birth to relatively small-brained newborns, with significant consequences on their cognitive development. The fetus normally navigates a narrow, convoluted birth canal by bending and turning its head at different phases during human delivery. This complicated procedure has a significant risk of birth complications, which may range from extended labor to stillbirth or maternal death. These issues were long thought to be the outcome of conflict between humans adjusting to upright walking and our larger brains. A research group led by Martin Hostler from the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich, and a team headed up by Pierre Frémond-Dayer from Aix-Marseille University, have now found that Australopithecines, who lived from about 4 to 2 million years ago, had a complex birth pattern compared to great apes. Because Australopithecines, such as Lucy, had relatively small brain sizes but already displayed morphological adaptations to bipedalism, they are ideal to investigate the effects of these two conflicting evolutionary forces, Hostler says. The researchers used three-dimensional computer simulations to develop their findings. Since no fossils of newborn Australopithecines are known to exist, they simulated the birth process using different fetal head sizes to take into account the possible range of estimates. Every species has a typical ratio between the brain sizes of its newborns and adults. Based on the ratio of non-human primates and the average brain size of an adult Australopithecus, the researchers calculated a mean neonatal brain size of 180 grams. This would correspond to a size of 110 grams in humans. For their 3D simulations, the researchers also took into account the increased pelvic joint mobility during pregnancy and determined a realistic soft tissue thickness. They found that only the 110-gram fetal head sizes pass through the pelvic inlet and midplane without difficulty, unlike the 180-gram and 145-gram sizes. This means that Australopithecus newborns were neurologically immature and dependent on help, similar to human babies today, Hostler explains. Well, in short, Bigfoot are upright like us, and so likely experience the same birthing issues as humans do, and the young are very vulnerable at a young age. More vulnerable to a number of issues, complications, diseases, or injury of any sort than a young ape. That would help explain their relatively low numbers, and if inbreeding is an issue, it could help explain the three-toed prints and such that have been found before. This would help explain why some human children are kidnapped, but are found safe and sound, relatively unhurt, out in the woods. They may have sought a surrogate after their own child died. Their young may die because they are more human-like than ape-like. Their children are more vulnerable outside the womb and aren't as fully developed. If they are vulnerable to temperature changes and diseases and predators, then their survival rate is likely low. If there isn't enough breeding stock available, inbreeding may happen and health issues may occur. Health issues that add further issues to their procreation process and survival of their species. This may also be reasons for cases like Oksana Terelitskaya's kidnapping and Albert Ostman's kidnapping, if they genuinely happened. They may see humans as viable mates, and therefore kidnap them to procreate. Now, this could only succeed if they are indeed human and are very close genetically, but even if the two aren't compatible, it doesn't mean it would stop them. As we've seen with animals, forced coitus doesn't always equal hate and aggression like it does with humans. It comes across more like that's just how things are rather than a hate crime. But it doesn't mean it's okay. Now again, this topic and the aforesaid pieces of information were originally part of the first episode of How Aggressive Are Sasquatch that I posted here on the channel. And I think it's worth watching, although be aware the audio quality isn't quite as good as I'd like at the beginning. I made it work. But anyway, most of the dead Bigfoot out there would likely be babies. It's a sad thought. But now the big question is upon us. Do they bury their dead? Well, the BFRO had this to say. The topic of Sasquatch burying their dead has been discussed within the BFRO and the Bigfoot community in general. It is quite possible that they bury their dead. Now this is where I struggle to understand exactly what they mean because the wording is slightly off. They may have learned this by watching First Nations people and the first white settlers to North America burying their found by leaving tracks. This was evident in the finding of the Skookum body print. This could also explain why so few tracks are found. I don't know if they're talking about how people buried their own and the Bigfoot followed their tracks to the site of burial, or what exactly, but I'm not going to worry about it. Maybe someone else can figure out what they mean a little bit more easily than I. To continue, this type of behavior demonstrates a form of higher intelligence, so it would make sense that Sasquatch learned to bury their dead to hide their remains. However, we currently have no proof to support this, so it continues to stand as a theory to be debated. Now, one common argument against the idea that Sasquatch bury their dead is that there is little evidence to believe a culture or species lacking fire usage and without tools could be capable of complex abilities like the burial of their dead. But there is a creature, or a hominid, that was discovered that may kind of change how we view things. Homo naledi, a hominin discovered in the Rising Star cave system in Africa's Cradle of Humankind in 2013, had human-like hands and feet, but a brain a third of the size of humans. A characteristic researchers previously attributed to a marker of far less intelligence than its Homo sapien relatives. But the assertion that bigger brains make for a smarter species may have been disestablished now that scientists have made a harrowing journey into the Rising Star Cave and discovering that the species, which lived about 335,000 to 236,000 years ago, buried its dead and marked the graves. It is the first non-human species in history known to do so. Paleoanthropologist and National Geographic explorer in residence Lee Berger told ABC News. Also, if I mispronounce anyone's names, I do apologize. To continue, the researchers began to hypothesize that Homo naledi buried its dead during continued excavations in 2010 and in July 2022. Those hunches were not only proven but amplified once Berger and his team found skeletal remains of Homo naledi and then carvings on the wall above them to mark those laid to rest there. The symbols included triangles, squares, and a sort of hashtag sign, as in two cross-hatching equal signs, Berger said. However, it is unclear what these carvings meant, and researchers will be delving into whether there is a random chance that Homo naledi used the same symbols as humans or if they were obtained from some sort of shared ancestry. It is unclear whether there was any interaction between Homo naledi and Homo sapiens, which would have existed at the same time about 250,000 years ago. Researchers are continuing to work on the molecular biology of the remains to determine whether there are any similarities to humans. The finding was striking and shocking, and erases the idea of human exceptionalism, that humans are different than animals and special due to their big brains. Homo naledi had brains about the size of a chimpanzee and yet practiced ritual burials, a behavior previously assumed was only done by humans, Berger said. Scientists also learned that Homo naledi had fire, as well as the kinds of animals they ate based on the location of bones found in the cave and the chambers adjacent to them, Berger said, adding that researchers knew nothing about the behavior of the species before the discovery. They may have even been placing artifacts in graves with the bodies. Suddenly, we went from having just these wonderful anatomy lesson of a species to an entire culture, Berger said. The species is characterized by their pin-headed and tall, skinny bodies that appear to not match the time period in which they lived. So it appears that Homo naledi did possess some sort of fire usage and tool usage. Now, it is unclear just how complicated their tools were. They were likely quite rudimentary. But it does seem that they had tool usage. However, we must remember that this is a field that is constantly changing. There are 1,000 opinions about the same pieces of information because there's different ways you can interpret it. She's restless. And so really, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. There may be a new paper that comes out. You okay, honey? See, I had to turn her around because she tried having her back facing the edge here, and I knew she was just going to push herself off, so I had to move her around, and I don't think she likes that. Anyway, we got to remember that this is a field that is constantly changing. And so in a couple years, we may see a paper that argues that the fire usage came from another species and that the tool usage, the inscribing marks, for example, were made post-burial and all sorts of things. We may never know. At the end of the day, though, if we're looking at only what we've been shown here, then it does appear like they had some sort of fire and tool usage. And that's really the argument that a lot of people have against Bigfoot burying their dead. And I've seen this numerous times. Why would Bigfoot bury their dead and have some sort of advanced mourning and rituals regarding the burial and care of their dead if they don't possess what typically goes hand in hand with that? Excuse you. Which is fire usage and tool usage. So without those two things, burying of the dead doesn't seem to make much sense for a lot of people. Now, I'm sure there's going to be someone who's claimed to see Bigfoot using tools that are more advanced than rocks and sticks. Now, I'm going to let Ushi go because she's getting a little distracting for me, and it's clear that she wants to go outside and play. So I'm going to let her out, and then I'll be right back. Now, I would like to bring out how there is a possible explanation as to why they would bury their dead, but would not have fire and tool usage. This is a potential theory. I don't put a massive amount of weight into it, because obviously we don't know hardly anything. But if it's true, or has any sort of truth to it, it could help explain this issue. So I'm going to read this off. This is a theory I've touched on in the past. So again, I'm not putting, all of my confidence in this theory, but it is a possibility. So I'm going to read it off to you, okay? If Sasquatch are similar to or are direct descendants of Homo erectus and occupied North America before the Native Americans, like the Cerruti Mastodon site implies, you should look that up. It's supposed to be older than 100,000 years old, although obviously, dating may be slightly off. At the end of the day, the numbers are projected as being very old. Then, when the Native Americans arrived, it may have caused a conflict between the two. The Native Americans, if this theory is correct, pushed them out of the nice areas to live in, and the Sasquatch became hobbits, if you will. Fire usage drew attention to them, so they had to wane off using it. Tools became less and less useful, and they stopped being made. In cold conditions and with such massive, dangerous animals as Smilodons, American lions, giant short-faced bears, and the like, the smaller individuals were targeted more often. Their genetics were not passed on. The larger and hairier individuals that were able to ward off attacks and defend themselves more easily also survived colder temperatures. They passed on their genetics and lived to survive and reproduce. The larger sizes of up to 8.5 feet may not be common. We must remember that many sightings detail 6 to 7 foot tall creatures, even in Alaska. Most 9 to 12 foot tall descriptions are fairly uncommon and are likely influenced by shadows, lighting, fear, adrenaline, etc. Without fire and tools, eating raw meat became more and more common. This change may have seen some loss of life, as eating food that has not been cooked can introduce harmful bacteria and parasites. However, if Sasquatch are genuinely real, they evidently can eat meat without problems. The hair makes sense if they are related to Homo erectus, as humans don't shed hair like other animals do. The long, shaggy hair, even in summertime, makes sense if they are related, somehow, to humans. Other animals like bears, dogs, and deer shed their winter coats. So my point is that not using tools and fire does not rule out them being a type of human or being related to humans somehow. And it does not rule out complex thought like burying their dead. In fact, life adapts, and the idea that they can mimic human speech and communicate in some sort of language, if that is true, implies more language skill than apes possess. And it seems like they retain the mental capabilities they've always had, but abandoned practices that ended up putting them in harm or that no longer proved useful. There's a lot of cases of Bigfoot being very keen and cunning, and that is more than you would expect from apes. Now, this is all assuming that this theory is true. It may not be, but I think it's one of the better theories because, frankly, there's a lot to the Gigantopithecus theory that does not hold up. Like their skulls looking so different from everything else here in North America, if even just a portion of it was found, it would stand out. So, and you're talking about a massive skull, by the way. We're not talking about something small and going, oh, well, that can make sense. We're talking about something massive, okay? So really, maybe not that big, but still huge. I mean, there's a side-by-side comparison right here. That's a big skull. That's a very big skull. And I honestly cannot see that kind of skull going undetected for a long length of time. But, of course, that theory that I just presented may not be true. So it's hard to say. But that is a possibility. So anyway, I don't believe that intelligence or lack of fire and tool use, although at first that seems like a very good point. In many ways it still is a good point, don't get me wrong. I meant what I said earlier. It's a good argument. I don't believe in the long run that it genuinely impacts the possibility of burying their dead, at least not to a massive degree. But it's still possible that it does. It's hard to say, of course. But, even if they aren't human at all, the intelligence to honor the dead has been shown by other species. For example here, on October 10th, 2003, a researcher watched as a female elephant named Eleanor collapsed. Her swollen trunk had been dragging on the ground while her ears and legs displayed evidence of another recent fall. One of her tusks was broken. An elephant named Grace, a member of a different social group, galloped toward Eleanor and tried to heave Eleanor back to her feet with her massive tusks. But Eleanor's back legs were too weak. The rest of the herd had moved on, but Grace remained with Eleanor at least another hour until the sun disappeared below the horizon and night fell over Kenya. Eleanor died the following morning at 11 a.m. I love elephants, so this is a sad story to read. The parade of elephants that followed may, in some deep fundamental way, be no different from those who gathered to pay respects to a dignitary lying in state. Over the course of several days, the carcass was visited by 5 other elephant groups, including several families that were completely unrelated to Eleanor. The elephants sniffed and poked the body, touching it with their feet and trunks. Even though the carcass had been visited by jackals, hyenas, vultures, and was under the control of lions by the 4th day, the elephants were rarely more than a few hundred meters away during daylight hours. Since interest in the carcass was not just limited to Eleanor's relatives, the observing scientists tentatively concluded that elephants had a generalized response to the dead. Supporting evidence for his conclusion comes from other studies, both observational and experimental. While these behaviors are clearly different from human death rituals, they're still unique as far as elephant behavior goes. But humans and elephants aren't the only ones to visit the bodies of the recently deceased. On May 6, 2000, a dead female dolphin was spotted on the seabed, 50 meters from the eastern coast of Makura Island near Japan. If I said that wrong, I apologize. I don't have time to Google it. 2 adult males remained with the body at all times, leaving the body only briefly to return to the surface to breathe. As the cause of death was unknown, divers attempted to retrieve the body. However, the presence of the 2 males prevented a successful retrieval. Returning the following day, in an additional effort to recover the carcass, the researchers found the same 2 males guarding the female, again making recovery impossible. By the 3rd day, the carcass had disappeared. Researchers assumed that it had simply drifted into deeper waters. It's far from being the only documented instance of dolphin death rituals. On July 20, 2001, a dead subadult male was spotted on a nearby seabed, wedged between 2 large boulders, attended by at least 20 other dolphins, both male and female. As divers attempted to approach and retrieve the body, groups of 1 to 3 male dolphins displayed aggressive postures, intercepting the swimmers, though their aggression did not escalate beyond posturing. Like the African elephants, the attending dolphins nudged and pushed at the carcass with their beaks and heads, appearing stressed and agitated. After divers finally retrieved the body, several of the dolphins continued to swim around the boat until it finally left to return to port. And when a dead dolphin calf was spotted by another group of scientists near the Canary Islands in April 2000, it was also surrounded by several other dolphins, one of whom was presumed to be the mother. By the 3rd day, the calf was floating on the surface, and by the 4th day, the calf was started, they made a mistake there, was starting to show signs of decay. While they did not attempt to recover the body, the researchers noted that whenever even a seabird attempted to approach the floating calf, it would immediately be chased away by the other dolphins. As this group of dolphins was under continuous human observation, researchers could be reasonably certain that they were acting differently than usual. They traveled slower, remaining in the same general area far longer than was typical. Both of these observations suggested that they were responding specifically to the death of the calf. In each case, the attending dolphins worked together to prevent others from approaching the dead body, sometimes showing signs of aggression to those who tried. In each case, the attending dolphins deviated from their typical routines. In the case of Thomas, a 9-year-old chimpanzee who died in 2010 at the Chimfunshi Wildlife Orphanage Trust in Zambia, again, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that, and unfortunately, every time I try and Google these names, it doesn't give me an answer on how to pronounce them. It gives me a bunch of fake websites and a lot of problems. So if I say these names incorrectly, I'm sorry, but the only way I can find out how to say these names is by looking up a YouTube video that talks about it, and I don't have time to do that right now. But anyway, the Chimfunshi, I'm guessing, Wildlife Orphanage Trust in Zambia, home to more than 100 chimps. Research scientists filmed the reactions of one community of 43 chimpanzees to Thomas's corpse. 38 of them gathered around and stayed by his side for almost 20 minutes. During that time, some of the chimps gently touched his body, smelled, and studied him closely. One of those visitors was Masya, a mother carrying her dead infant. At the time, there was an outbreak of a respiratory illness among the chimps. A few days earlier, Masya had been seen placing her dead child in a grassy sunlit patch and retreating to the shade, where she sat watching, her eyes rarely straying from her infant. Every few minutes she strode back to the clearing to inspect her baby's body. At times she did so hurriedly, jumping up and rushing forward as if she thought she detected a stirring. She studied her child's face intently, peered into her gaping mouth and wide eyes, and brushed away the flies. Finally, she placed her knuckles softly against her infant's neck, hoping, it seems, for any sign of life. The chimpanzees gathered at Thomas's side and also appeared to be trying to come to grips with what had happened. One female smacked his body, hard, while the others paid close attention, looking, perhaps, for a reaction. Their faces were serious, their manner subdued. One adult male appeared even more distraught than the others. The researchers say that this chimp had cared for Thomas for over 4 years and had a very strong social relationship with the dead chimp. He left and returned several times to view the body, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. Finally, he stepped between the others to get as close as possible. He scrutinized the body and erupted in frantic screams while walking rapidly over the cadaver. Was this a chimpanzee wail of grief? Had the male friend and other chimpanzees come together to mourn Thomas? The scientists who recorded these events prefer not to use such words. Yet the chimpanzees' behaviors, which mirror many of our own when we lose a loved one, suggest that, like us, they have trouble accepting death when it comes to one of their own. As with most emotions in animals, we do not yet understand their reactions with total clarity. But, as Charles Darwin wisely observed, they may very well have meaning. Perhaps we are the only animals with foreknowledge of death, but when it comes to grieving, we are not so unique. The study of animal grief is a young field, largely because studies of any animal behaviors that one might think of as human were ignored for much of the 20th century. It was commonly held that non-human animals were only reactive beings, lacking thoughts and emotions and responding to stimuli as unthinking, unfeeling robots. Scientists were cautioned about being anthropomorphic, that is, regarding animals as they are often depicted in naive films and storybooks, as if they were people dressed up in fur or feathers. Researchers who thought they detected animal emotions, especially those that we think of as uniquely human, such as love, joy, or grief, were considered to be sentimentalists, and their reports, such as Darwin's about the grieving cows, were dismissed as anecdotal. Now, there is a very real concern with people anthropomorphizing animals. I know one of the biggest issues people have had is that Disney films have gotten people to believe, in films like it, that you can dump off your dogs and they can live a happy life, they are free, and they can find their way home, and that they can survive. And really, you're subjecting that animal to death. And there's a lot of issues with people putting way too much emphasis on how an animal may feel or what they're thinking, and it's difficult to know what's right and what's wrong, of course. But it does seem like far too many people believe that Disney is real life. However, there's also very real concern with being so cold and so distant and not wanting to touch emotions and not wanting to believe that animals could be holding emotions, to where you can end up doing some very horrible, horrible things and explaining it away as being okay because, well, you know, animals, they can't feel anything. You know, they're just stupid. And it's a very real issue. There has to be some sort of balance there. And of course, it's difficult to know what is the right balance to have. But, you know, I do feel like it's a very wrong thing to be overly anthropomorphic, but it's also very much a wrong thing as well to be overly clinical and sterile in your view of everything. And it's a worry. So I see a lot of that with all the medical experiments that are done on animals and the way that some of these animals are treated, like how monkeys have been treated in the past. It's horrible and despicable. The advancement of science should not come at the expense of others. And the way some of these animals have been treated, I mean, I'm not a big fan of monkeys. I want to be clear about that. Nor am I a big fan of chimps. But you cannot treat them as if their lives don't matter at all either. You treat others the way you want to be treated. And the way some people have treated animals is absolutely despicable. So there's very much a gray area in between those two. But being too much of any one thing, in this case, as well as many others, is a very bad thing. So anyway, continuing on. Elephants, dolphins, and chimpanzees all have complex social behaviors that we only partly understand. Since it is so rare for humans to observe a natural death in the wild, most of the information that we do have comes from non-experimental case studies thanks to quick-thinking researchers. Even still, the available evidence offers an important reminder that humans are not the only animals who respond to death in a particular way. And the list of non-human animals that seem to do so keeps expanding. Recent reports suggest that giraffes and western scrub jays may mourn as well, each with their own customs. Of course, those observations, as affecting as they are, do not tell us how an animal's mentally processing something such as the discovery of another's remains or the loss of a lifelong partner or child. They also depend largely on serendipity, on someone being on hand to record the event. And then they are open to any number of interpretations, since we humans readily project our own thoughts and emotions onto others. Scientists thus prefer to design experiments that can be replicated. If scientists conduct the same experiment, they should obtain the same results. And so that came from both the BBC and I think that's Latham's Quarterly. I'm going to link everything down below if I can. But I thought those were some very interesting points. And so, only one of those creatures, the chimpanzee, could actually bury their own dead. And even then, the way an animal was raised, if it was raised in the wild or raised in a zoo, the environment in the zoo, whether or not it's easy to go off and bury, whether or not they would be intervened, and they know that, so they wouldn't even try. All sorts of different things can come into mind. The situation that they may encounter is if there's predators nearby, they may not want to move that body around. They may want to stay where they're at because they know the area better, and they don't want to be surprised by an animal that wants to take that body from them. I don't know. There's just so many different factors there. But that poor elephant, and dolphins aren't always the nicest creatures either, but they have their nice moments as well. But obviously they can't bury anything, right? They have only flippers. So at the end of the day, it's possible that a Bigfoot mourning one of its own and trying to cover it up to protect it from predators could happen. It's not that far out there. And it may be one of the reasons why they throw rocks at people and try to scare people off. I mean, you'll hear all sorts of different reports where, in one case, Sasquatch are very peaceful, and others where it's like they're chasing somebody down with the purpose of running them off. Because it doesn't seem like they want to hurt that person if they wanted to. Some of these people have noted how, it could have ran up on me and killed me so easily and quickly, but yet it didn't. But it was very clear that it wanted me out of there, pushing trees down, throwing rocks at them, rushing up behind them and disappearing, all sorts of different things. And this may be one of the reasons why they may only act like this when they're protecting a body of one of their own or one of their young. So that could be why some of these roars or that people say just shakes you to the core is uttered. It may be one of the reasons why they throw rocks and all that other stuff. Like I mentioned before, they're trying to get you away from the body. Just like those dolphins were posturing and trying to scare people off and trying to keep them away from the body. Now, I know Matt Pruitt talked about in his book how maybe one of the reasons that they do this is because they're trying to protect one of their hunting spots. They are likely ambush predators, and so they want to sit in a spot and wait for something to come by and they can rush out and grab it. I know Lyle Blackburn talked about in Beyond Boggy Creek. I just started reading the book, so I'm barely into it, folks, but he talked about at the outset how there was a hunter down in the swamps who found that there was some good hog sign, and he threw out some bait for him and was sitting up there in the tree, and he noticed a Bigfoot kind of sneaking up, moving from tree to tree, and then it ran out and bludgeoned a hog to death. Just burst out and grabbed it. It doesn't seem like they chase prey down. It seems like they'll rush out to grab it and strike it when it doesn't expect it. They ambush their prey. And so that would make sense if they want to keep you out because you're going to scare off anything in the area, or they don't want to have you be their prey. They want to keep you out. They don't want to worry about you being even remotely near them. That could be why they try and chase people off as well. But I think this theory holds a little bit more weight in the sense that those dolphins showed, and every day we show, we care for our dead. And we don't like it when people try to mess with our dead. That's why grave robbers are not looked upon fondly. You're messing with our dead. These are our friends. These are our family. You get away from them. You're disrespecting them. It's considered a very taboo thing to do. So I could see that being one of the reasons why they chase people off like that. It's a thought. So if they are protecting their dead, and that's why they throw rocks at people and whatnot, like I said earlier, maybe if you were to keep pushing forward and ignoring the warnings, you may be able to get some visual evidence of a Bigfoot. may be able to get video or pictures of a dead body, or one may pop out to try and like posture and bluff you and try and keep you away. However, you know, there's a very high likelihood you would get hurt or killed. So I cannot recommend that for anybody. I mean, if you could wear Iron Man armor and just go right through and not have any worries, that'd be one thing, but that doesn't exist, not for us. So it's not something I could recommend, but it does get you wondering, gets the mind rolling. But the issue I have with burying their dead is that burying preserves bones more than it removes the bones from the environment. That's why we find some skeletons even hundreds of years after they were buried. Again, Homo naledi, although they lived, according to the article I found, about 335 to 236,000 years ago, they found over 1,500 specimens from at least 15 Homo naledi individuals at the site. It said here, Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker found an additional 133 Homo naledi specimens in the nearby Lesedi chamber in 2013, representing at least another 3 individuals, 2 adults and a juvenile. So the burying of their dead is at least one of the factors for why the bones were preserved, and keeping it in a cave where it kind of keeps the elements at bay is probably another reason. It probably helped. But the point is this, burying tends to preserve bones. So it only really explains away why we don't find skeletons above the ground. It does not explain away not finding them when we're digging. Now, I will say that there was a body that was found pretty recently. It's in between the Memorial Bridge, an extensive levee that was built to control the Clearwater River and the Snake River. There's actually a confluence right nearby, and it used to flood pretty frequently over there. So that levee was built to try and control the flood waters, and that was all put in, and a lot of work was done there. Just across from the bridge, you have Pepsi Park, and you have a Kubota dealership, and there's a road kind of put in down there. There's a whole bunch of work that was done.
We just learned less than a couple of hours ago that the remains found here were in fact human, and I've been here throughout the day watching people dig the ground to try and find more remains. Police say that a biological anthropologist was called in and confirmed that the remains are human. Police also confirmed that no foul play seems involved, and the remains are believed to be from the Nez Perce tribe, but police are still investigating on how long the remains might have been buried for.
We've had some calls like this before, but nothing where it turned into what it is now, where we've had anthropologists and things. Sometimes people will find a bone in a yard, and we have someone come in, it's a dog bone or something. So this was definitely out of the norm for us, something we are not experts in.
According to someone who worked on yesterday's excavation crew, the crew was digging around the bridge to make room for future construction. That's when the dig crew saw what they thought was a piece of old pipe in the soil. After further inspection, the crew found what looked to be a skull and bones at around waist deep and called police. I'm told police and investigators plan to be back out here again tomorrow, and the walking trail under the bridge will remain closed until the investigation is wrapped up. In Lewiston, Nathan Hun, Creme 2 News.
And you can see how there was a lot of activity in that area, but it was only once someone was digging right there in that specific spot that they found that body. So, you can logically reason, at least to a certain degree, that whenever logging roads are made, maybe they're just right above where a body is, or they're just 5 feet away from where a body is. And, you'd never know. You would have no idea, except for maybe if there's a mudslide that happens. But even then, it may be still encased in the dirt, and unless someone needs to move it, it may just sit there, and now it's encased, but instead of over here, way down here. It's hard to say. It's just so speculative, where you don't really know what to think about anything. Now, obviously, that area had a lot of construction activity. Apparently, someone was doing excavation work there. I think they were trying to dig a trench for like an electrical line or something. But they called 911 to report the discovery in the morning. So then the police came in, and they called a biological anthropologist in to assist, and it was found that the skeleton was likely ancestral remains, or in other words, Native American. And the Nez Perce tribe then handled the case and decided how to proceed with the remains in the scene, according to the police. And that's it. After that, no one was interested. It's like, oh, it was a native guy. Case closed. I mean, I'd like to know more, but okay. I did think it was interesting how an anthropologist was brought in, but I also thought it was interesting how, just how long it took for that body to be located. It had been there for likely a very long time. Whether it would be over 200 years or over 500 years or what, I do not know. But it had been there for some time at least. And again, as soon as it was found out to be Native American, everyone just was like done with it. So we don't know how old those bones were. I highly doubt they were going to want to test it after that point, because anything Native American, they don't really want to deal with it anymore. They realize that, oh, not our jurisdiction, not our problem. We don't want to offend anybody. Let's get it over to the native tribe and they can handle it, which is nice. It's nice to see people being respectful of Native American bones, finally. But there's a lot of questions that went unanswered there. So, anytime logging is done in an area, and that's usually when you're going to be doing any kind of digging in wilderness areas, except for, if you're putting in a house, or if you are trying to put in a building, right? Anything like that. Typically, it's only when logging is done that a lot of these areas out in wilderness areas are going to have any kind of excavation done, because you're looking at etching roads upon roads through the mountains. Although there are times when there are roads put in that aren't for logging, and there are plenty of times where that's happened, I find logging is when you're going to get way out there. So, whenever that happens, there is an opportunity for a Bigfoot body, if one were buried, to be found. However, there is also the possibility that they would miss it and it would never be found. I also don't know, A, how much of the body would be preserved given how much heavy equipment like bulldozers are involved in moving the dirt the bones would be in. So, it's quite possible that the bones would be busted up and pulverized to a large enough degree where any definitive features would be destroyed. I also don't know, B, whether or not anyone would even recognize that a skeleton was there. After all, it would be easy to scoop up or shove the body/skeleton while it's still encased in dirt and may be difficult to see. It's also possible that because they aren't looking for it, they wouldn't notice anything. They're busy doing their job and focusing on what they need to do. And see how the logging companies would react. Depending on how many individuals saw the skeleton and the integrity of whomever is in charge, you may see a hush order, or they might call 911. I think the identifiability of the skeleton or any bones from the skeleton would play a significant part as well. Big finds have been made at quarries. It was the partial skeleton of a male Neanderthal, or Neanderthal, as they say these days, that was unearthed during quarrying operations in the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856 that was first recognized as a distinct form of human. And fossils have been found in construction sites, so it seems doing the right thing has happened in similar situations. But if a police presence could halt production, it's possible a higher-up could try to cover it up. It's completely theoretical, though. And again, it depends on the integrity of the person who's in charge. There are some people who will do anything to get money. I mean, crime is a perfect opportunity to show you that. People will be willing to kill their fellow man, look them right in the eye and kill them if it means that they can get money. So, something as simple as just ignoring bones, that's easy. So, I don't know. It really depends on the individuals involved as to what would happen. Now, I will say that given the repercussions of covering something like that up, it's unlikely someone would cover it up unless, 1, it appears to be the body of a long-dead, purposefully buried native person, in which case they may be concerned that the site would be closed down if its presence is known. 2, that it was a murder that happened there, and they're worried that a police presence and thorough investigation would cause a massive halt to any kind of work that they want to do. Or 3, they know about Sasquatch and are concerned that any solid evidence of its existence could get the area locked down before judgment can be made, and then the area would subsequently become protected land. Theoretically, of course. Because that hasn't happened yet, we don't really know what the process would be like. And you know that if a Bigfoot body was found, people would really campaign hard to get them protected, and one of the things that they'd want to do is stop logging. A lot of people who love Bigfoot and are interested in Bigfoot hate logging, and I can't blame them to a large degree, but let's face the facts, we need logging. It's just how is it done, and to what degree is it done and all that. And even then, I don't like logging. I hate how logging leaves the land looking like, but I need paper. So it's really a moral dilemma there. But, I find that last option much less likely. And let's be honest here, the second option doesn't seem very likely either. Because unless someone is involved with a murder that happened in that same area, and they did cover it up and it was buried there, I don't really feel like they would be overly concerned with that. Although, yes, there would be a lot of concern of that area being, shut down. They'd probably move to a different area. The only kind of explanation I can think of is if it would be found out that the person worked for that logging company, but we're assuming that this isn't a human per se, but it's a Bigfoot. So really, no. And I don't really find the second option to be very likely either for a number of different reasons, but I think the first one is the only one that really holds any kind of weight. But, I suppose strong logging companies may have direct relatives and any kind of police force in the area, because typically logging operations aren't done right outside a main populace. They're done near small towns and in rural areas. So I suppose you could have someone in there that would want the police to cover something up, but I don't see that being highly likely. But, most workers would probably report anything human-like. That's what's happened before. So if it is discovered, the police would become involved. Now, if the bones are like those of a Homo erectus, basically very human-like, and you don't have a complete cranium, because the cranium does look a little bit different compared to a normal human, but there are people who have had such strange conditions that absolutely mutate how the morphology of the skull looks, to the point where, if it looks human, then it's probably human, and it would probably be just written off, especially if it's old enough to look like a native person. Then it would probably be handed off to the local tribe, just like how that body found in Lewiston, Idaho was treated. As you can see here, here's a skull of someone who had a very sad disorder. It looks extremely painful. So, look at how deformed that is compared to a normal human being skull. And you compare a Homo erectus skull to a Homo sapien skull, it's not that far off. So I'm not bringing this out to make fun of that poor person. You can tell that would have had to have been painful, if not physically, then emotionally, because someone made fun of them at some point. It's cruel and rotten how some people act. But it is an example of what I'm talking about. There have been so many different changes to the skull morphology for human beings to where if it just looks a little bit off, I think most people would just assume what it is and not go to the effort to really try and find out. And if it's more recent, then the only ways that they could identify the body would not work. A DNA test, unless it's a very detailed test, would only say that there are no relatives in the database. And any kind of tooth pattern attempting to identify someone on file who's been to a dentist, you have the tooth marks that people try to match up sometimes, it wouldn't work because that person would not be on file, right? So at the end of the day, all you'd have is a John Doe. The biggest issue that you have is if a qualified expert like a biological anthropologist comes along and analyzes it and notices something's off, and if they go for a detailed DNA examination, in which case that would be a jackpot of a scientific discovery unless it's intercepted for some reason. So, you can imagine that would hit the news. So that would be an issue. But I do think that there's a possibility that Sasquatch bury their dead, and I don't think in most cases you would get a very detailed examination of the body if one is found, and that's assuming that you have enough of the body to really identify. If one dies, though, if it's like a lone male, I don't think the body would be buried because they're a lone male. If they are like... But, overall, I think there's a possibility that Sasquatch bury their dead. But given their probable solitary lifestyle, I don't think a lone male would be buried. If he dies, no one is there to help him. He's a lone male. You would probably go into the remotest or safest feeling place that he knows of and would expire in peace there. However, if he dies from natural causes, has heart issues, and he dies, then he could die anywhere. And wild animals would find the bodies, scavengers would eat it up, and more than likely the bones would be strewn about. And, the only reason it would be discovered is if someone finds one of those bones and is able to identify it. Now, the females would probably experience a similar fate, I'd imagine. I think it would be the young, though, that would be buried. The reason I say this is that their bodies are smaller, first of all. I don't think the body would be easy to distinguish from that of a human child, except for certain features like the feet possessing a mid-tarsal break. However, there are some people who apparently have a form of mid-tarsal break, so only a skilled, knowledgeable eye would see the difference there. And, seeing as how human and ape mothers have strong connections to their children, the burial of their child that they conceived, gave birth to, and maybe even raised for some time would make more sense to me than trying to bury an adult relative or stranger. Again, in my opinion. And the amount of dirt that would need to be moved to bury a 7-foot tall or more adult Sasquatch is considerable enough to where I don't see very many being buried that way before one is excavated and found. It would likely stand out, unless it's underneath a tree or something. But even then, there's a possibility that tree would be knocked over, it would be excavated, you name it, depending on where it's at. It's difficult to say. And then again, a bear may come around, smell that dead body, and try and dig it up and would try and eat it. So, there's that as well. And there's a possibility that someone could come across that. It's really the luck of the draw, I guess, if someone's out there, whether or not they'd even find it. Especially with so many native burials being excavated and the bones taken in the past and put into private collections and museums, someone found what looked like a buried body that looked like it was buried by Native Americans. It could be excavated. There were periods of time where native artifacts and bones and all sorts of different things connected to native people were sold and looked for because it brought people money. But, they were put into private collections and museums and all sorts of things. More about that section of history can be found in books like, Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, written by Jennifer Raff. I read that a little bit. I wasn't able to finish that book, so I can't speak to the quality of the entire book, but I do remember reading part of that. And it was pretty good, the parts that I read. I'd like to get that book back. I got it from the library, and that's why I wasn't able to finish it. But there's also documentaries like Thieves of Time, featuring Tony Hillerman. I couldn't find it on YouTube. We actually found it on one of the DVDs that we purchased. But that was a very interesting documentary that, again, went into how Native American bones and artifacts were not treated with a lot of care in the past. People would actually take bodies and try to sell them off. It was despicable. But that was an installment of the Robert Redford-produced movie series adapted from the novel series made by Tony Hillerman, which I really love. They're really well-done movies. Now, there is something to be said for the amount of people going out and looking for bones. That was actually talked about again in Matt Pruitt's book, The Phenomenal Sasquatch, and this is what he had to say. Since remains cannot be found by conducting armchair research, phone interviews, data analyses, or examining evidence in a lab, we have to focus solely on field investigators to explore this possibility. The pursuit of the Sasquatch and its habitat began in earnest in the 1950s, or roughly 70 years ago. While it's impossible to know how many individuals have been engaged in this endeavor over the decades, I am confident that it is a very low number, though that number has increased over time. In the initial years, there were only a few individuals who publicly stated their involvement with the pursuit of Sasquatches in the field. We've already covered investigators like Green, Titmus, and DeHinden, but others emerged throughout the mid to late 20th century. Though their names might constitute a roster of around 100 to 200 field researchers in total over the 20th century, almost none of these individuals worked in any sort of professional and coordinated manner. Rather, they were engaging in weekend excursions or the occasional expedition, which might last as long as a week or two. Most importantly, it becomes painfully obvious when researching the stated goals and after-action reports of these idiosyncratic efforts that none of them were aimed at locating or recovering bones. Nearly every single field effort was explicitly intended to encounter and document living Sasquatches or their footprints. While these individuals might have entered the environment with a Sasquatch incorporated into their interpretive schemas, and therefore primed to investigate remains that they encountered, they wouldn't be any more likely to encounter remains for the reasons I've previously stated unless they were specifically trying to locate them. As shocking as it might be to some readers, the whole of Sasquatch field research includes virtually no attempts to intentionally discover remains. What little effort there might have been consists of a select few researchers, quote, keeping an eye out, unquote, for bones while engaged in the act of trying to encounter a Sasquatch or its sign. To marry these two assumptions, let's think about the possibility of one of the few field researchers incidentally discovering remains while pursuing living Sasquatches. At any given time, there are probably less than 24 competent field researchers putting boots on the ground in pursuit of the Sasquatch. There are roughly 677,464,000 hectares of forested land in North America, or roughly 2,615,703 square miles. What percentage of that land constitutes viable Sasquatch habitat is debatable, but for the sake of the argument, we will make a drastic reduction and use 1 million square miles. To further illustrate the odds, let's be extremely generous and say that there are 50 competent field investigators actively pursuing Sasquatches on a given day in North America. What percentage of that ground would we reasonably assume is being surveyed during daylight hours? After all, we wouldn't expect investigators to find these bones at night, when visual conditions are compromised. Let's be even more generous and say that the average field investigator is surveying 5 square miles per day, a very liberal estimate, especially in a densely forested environment. 50 field investigators covering 5 square miles a day covers 250 square miles per day searching for any sign of Sasquatches. That amounts to 0.025% of viable habitat, a dreadfully small percentage. But overall, it's hard to say if Bigfoot buried their dead. It's really just a massive blank spot. And I'm not really sure where I fall on this because I don't know enough information to really make a decision on it. I think there are ways that you could explain away them burying their dead, and it could make sense, but there's also some problems with it. Like, why haven't we found any? You can kind of explain it away, but we don't know enough to really say for sure. Until we're able to track them down and repeatedly tag them and film them and, sadly enough, kill one, and be able to examine them and figure out what they're like and kind of move forward from there like we have done with other species, I think there's a lot of questions that will go unanswered. We can make some logical conclusions, but until we know more, we just don't know. It's an unfortunate fact. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know this maybe wasn't eye-opening or a game changer, if you will, to the whole field of Bigfoot research. I didn't really crack anything wide open, but I did have an interesting time writing up this video and trying to film it. This is a very new thing for me, trying to film inside the house like this. I would have preferred if I were able to do this video like I normally do, but I'm glad I got to have Ushi in the video, at least for part of it. And I have to live with this. My knee is not going to be better for some time, so I'm going to have to kind of work around it and keep chugging on, keep moving forward. So if you guys enjoyed this, please let me know your thoughts down below. Actually, do you believe the Bigfoot buried their dead? What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think about the whole 9 yards. But, I love hearing from you guys and getting to talk with you. It means a lot to me. I know sometimes I don't get back to people as quickly as I'd like. Sometimes I'll wait a little bit to get back to people, and then before I know it, it's been 6 months. And so I don't mean to leave people hanging like that. I'm sorry. I do tend to read people's comments, but you know what? Sometimes I'm not even notified of people's comments, and I'm not notified of their replies more often than not. It's annoying. And I think a lot of people aren't notified that I replied back to them either. So, YouTube is really annoying. If you guys want to try and circumvent YouTube to make sure you get notified every time I come out with a new video, you can go to the Idaho Bigfoot newsletter. You just put in your email, and I'll just email you every time I come out with a new video. You'll have to check your spam folder and kind of keep an eye on that, but that way you'll be notified. And I try to keep on top of that as well. I have to juggle a lot of different things, but I'm working on it. So anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.